I don't know how much you know about Debbie Meier, but she's someone I have admired for as long as I've been a reporter. She started the Central Park East schools way back when, which were remarkable in terms of community involvement, in terms of community service. I mean, she had kids in kindergarten doing community service. It was maybe as simple as folding napkins that would be at homes for old folks. But she has always, it's the habits of mind. It's what do you know? How do you know what you know? How do you know that you know? You know, just pushing to keep on asking questions. And she has received, I think, every honor that an educator could receive, but she still deserves more. We should create some new ones.
Well, I don't know. I don't know as much as you know, but I do know we are amongst a leader in the field, and again, someone who has been an innovator of disruption. When I think of charter schools or schools that are created to do something different, I think of the people who start them, because school leadership is very important. And we need people, we need a place so that real innovation and real innovators can be involved in public education. And sometimes that doesn't happen under the bureaucracies that currently exist. And so,
well, let's turn to Debbie.
Yeah, Debbie, tell us about yourself.
Well, nice to be here. See you both. I have been one of those extremely lucky people who managed to be in something like a charter school since I first became a teacher some 50 years ago. And it by happenstance.
The District 4 schools weren't, your schools weren't charter schools. There was no such thing.
And they were, the entire district, this is East Harlem, had about 20 traditional neighborhood schools and about 20 schools of choice. And all of the schools, including the neighborhood schools, had a considerable amount of independence and were able to shape their own culture. And that's the thing that I feel most strongly about.
So what was your reaction when you heard about this idea of charter schools? Because after all, some of the key people in the charter movement were at that meeting back in 1988. Cy Flegel from District 4, Albert Shanker. What was your, when you first heard about this charter school?
I first heard, I assumed it being that we were talking about creating, that they were another word for what we were doing in District 4. And later on, what we were doing in the pilot schools in Boston. And I didn't think of it as being in contrast to public education. It was what I hoped eventually all public schools would be. That if it's a public institution, it should be democratic. It should be one in which the voices of all its constituencies are heard, and in which strong-minded adults hang out with kids. One of the things that mattered most to me was I wanted kids who knew what it was like to be an adult in a democratic community where you could disagree sharply but collegially, and where you could discuss something today and decide to try it tomorrow, and if it doesn't work, you can change it the next week.
Why are you supporting this coalition of independent schools?
Well, there are because unfortunately, two things are going on together. One, a drive to give teachers more respect and build democratic communities, and a drive in both the regular public system and the charter system to be more standardized, more test-oriented, more compliance-oriented. So
it's not a case of all the charter schools being wonderful.
No, or in fact, I'd say that a great many of the charter schools treat teachers more disrespectfully, treat parents more disrespectfully. So the whole idea, I think, that Steve had is, that I was so excited about was instead of having a fight between public schools and charter schools, we need to argue out questions of how we govern each other.
Chris and I have lots of questions, and we've had some questions sent in, but we're going to pause for a commercial. We're back with Chris.
Yes, we are back. Some people would argue that innovation has to be visible, it has to be desirable, and it has to be doable. And when I say visible, I mean people have to see it, meaning the schools have to share it, right? We have to have a sharing community. And then desirable, they have to have results that make a traditional school system want to replicate. And then doable, meaning that it can't be so unique that somebody else can't do it. I wouldn't just know your comments to those things.
Well, in District 4, Sci Legal had a phrase called creative non-compliance. And I think it's a wonderful way of thinking about what every citizen should be, a creative non-compliant. Or you could look at it the other way around, a compliant. And in short, they should not assume that they're always going along with what's happening.
But the question, though, of charter schools collaborating with traditional public schools.
I don't even think it's a question. I mean, I see them as the same. The pilot schools in Boston are happen to be part of the system, but they are as much as have all the autonomies that charters have, but they're part of the system.
So, but do you find that?
So we don't need to have. I think the big shift has to be for public schools, and that means for citizens, to say we don't have to have schools that are all alike just because they have one governing board. The governing boards need to be moved down close to the school. The people making decisions about what to do tomorrow should be people who are going to be affected by tomorrow.
Are you worried about the health of the charter schools? I mean, we read about scandals in Arizona, Ohio, and so on and so forth, almost on a daily basis.
Yeah, of course we have scandals on a daily basis in the regular public schools too. But I think that's one of the reasons I also like small schools where parents were part of the governing of the school, because I think they catch corruption when it takes place. They're the on-site vigilance of people who have a stake in that community. You know, my original three phrases for what we all need is small, self-governing schools of choice. Well, 30 years, 40 years later, I can see some problems with choice, but I think controlled choice, I think we can solve the problems. And certainly the regular public schools are having problems about segregation and kids being in niches, all kids of certain type here and kids of certain types of families there. So I think we could solve it with choice if we really want to solve it. And I think the advantage of a small school is precisely that it's an opportunity to have direct democracy. And I think wherever we can, it's an enormous advantage. It's a much more efficient way of human beings relating to each other than somebody deciding over there, some central headquarters.
But it's so messy, this democracy.
Well, I know, but that's exactly why I want it. So they realize democracy is messy. And also that you need the time, citizens need the time, just as teachers need the time to go visit other places. You don't innovate just outside in your head, you innovate because you widen your experience. So schools in which, teachers, we see the teacher in a room who closes the door. And in the old days, the good old days, you had a lot more independence inside that room, for good and bad. Now, if we're going to open the door and teachers are going to be involved in decision making, then in some ways it's scary for teachers, because anybody can walk into their room, people have a right to criticize each other, but that is what democracy is about. And I think we grow up, ourselves and our children grow up without ever having seen democracy in operation. I mean, literally, how could you prepare people to be shoemakers if they never see a shoe?
With that being said, I think we want to thank you for your thoughts today. But I think we want to hear from these young people here and get their reaction, perhaps, to some of the things that you've expressed.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Thank you so much, Debbie,
Thank you.
for being with us. And yes.